Okay, thank you, Benny, for including our paper in this conference. This paper is showing work with Ronnie, who is in the audience, and I'm sure you all know, and also with Guillermo Ordóñez-Calafi, who is a colleague of mine at the University of Bristol. So let me say first that the version that I'm going to present is not exactly the same version that you can see in the paper that was circulated. I apologize to the discussant about that, so I have shared the slide with him. Hopefully this is a better version of what you have at the moment. So let's see. So first of all, what do we do in this paper? We look at the arguably simple question. Do ES funds vote according to their stated objective? Now, why do we care about voting? Because voting has been advocated as the way in which ES investors and investors in general can change corporate governance and ES in particular. So if we have a mutual fund that is supposed to be environmental and social friendly, that's what we mean by ES, we expect them to vote according to this objective, meaning in a pro-environmental and social way. So the question is, why would they do that? Well, the obvious reason is that because they have a fiduciary duty to do so. Probably there may be a reputational cost if they fail to do so. So this means that we should expect ES funds to vote according to their stated objectives. But it is not that simple, right? So why wouldn't they vote with environmental and social objectives? Well, we listened yesterday about Maria Sunta's paper that sometimes there could be a conflict between sustainability and performance, right? It is not that clear that more sustainability is positively related to more performance, right? Now, the type of conflict that we are going to look at is not exactly the same that Maria Sunta discussed, but it's actually a conflict that arises in in families that offer different type of funds. Funds that have an explicit environmental and social objective, and other more, let's say, traditional funds, right, that are trying to maximize performance, right? So what happens when a family that is traditionally in the business of providing financial performance is offering as well environmental and social mutual funds, right? And what is the conflict that arises at the time of voting on environmental and social proposals? Why do we care about that? Well, lately, the number of offerings and the amount, the total assets under management on environmental and social funds has been growing exponentially, right? Every other year, we have a record inflow in environmental and social funds, and also in the number of offerings, as we can see from the plot. And this has drawn the attention of academics. We can see how many papers on ES funds, ESG in general we have, the press, and also, of course, from the SEC, right? And they are increasing scrutiny. So in a speech that took place about 1 year ago, who was the acting chair of the SEC said that investors are demanding ESG investment strategies and opportunities, but funds may not always reflect those investor preferences in their voting. And they are now taking some actions in order to address these potential claims of greenwashing. In particular, recently they have charged Bank of New York Mellon because they had some misstatement and omissions regarding ESG considerations. And also there is a proposed rule change regarding the fund's name, meaning that funds are not supposed to have misleading names. Now, the original rule is from 2001. Now they are planning to change that in order to explicitly address environmental and social funds. So you're not supposed to sell a product that contains an ESG label or another related word in a name if you are not acting accordingly, right? And they have also included, in particular, proxy voting policies and practices into the examination priorities last year. So, what do we do? As I said before, we are going to study ES fund support for environmental and social proposals. But in particular, we are going to focus on these mutual funds that probably have a conflict of interest with the other funds that are not supposed to be ES. What do we mean? We all know that some families have been traditionally in the business of ES, like Calvert, Domini, and some others. But some other families are more in the money-conscious spectrum, and the typical BlackRock, Vanguard, Fidelity. It is not clear whether they are ES or not, right? Actually, we will show you that they are not as ES as they claim to be. So, in a way, we have 4 different types of funds. We have ES funds offered by ES families, but we also have ES funds offered by non-ES families. And the same with non-ES funds. Now, what we are going to claim here is that for ES funds in non-ES families that we have in here, there is this particular conflict of interest. Now, probably not all votes are equally important. When it comes to ES, most of the proposals fail, but some of them may be close to the majority threshold. And actually, what we are going to say here is that the conflict between funds will be more salient when the proposal is about to pass. So, what do we find? First of all, we plot the average support that each of the 4 categories that I showed you before is providing to proposals that ended up with different voting outcomes. So, as a reference, here we have the 45-degree lines that you can think about the 45-degree line as the representative investor, right? So for a proposal that got an outcome of 20%, 20% of the investor voted for, and so on and so forth, right? Something that you have to keep in mind through the presentation is that probably if all investors are voting against, we can... Okay, sorry. It's fine, I will stay here. It's okay. So, for a proposal that receives 0% support, probably all investors agree that it is a bad proposal. If a proposal got 100% support, probably it is a good proposal, but in the middle, it is not so clear, right? And of course, if all shareholders think about the proposal in the same way, they should all be in the same line, right? Now, let's see the four groups and how they behave or how they vote in these different proposals. The first line that I'm showing here are non-ES funds of non-ES families. And as you would expect, they are always less supportive than the average investor. On the opposite side, we have ES funds of ES families. And they are always more supportive than the average investor. These are non-ES funds in ES families, which are generally supportive. And the interesting thing happens when we look at ES funds on non-ES families. So what do we see here? Actually, they are more supportive than the average investor when the proposal gets very low support, and also in general when it gets very high support. But right in the middle, close to the majority threshold, they start being less and less supportive, right? In a way that they are more likely to align their vote with the vote of the family when the proposal is about to pass. Now, almost mechanically, you would expect that for every voting outcome, the support is increasing, right? So it is quite surprising that actually here, we can see that they are more supportive of proposal that got a 20 to 30% outcome compared to a proposal that got a 40 to 50, which is in principle hard to explain, right? If you are curious about ISS, because this is a question that we often get, ISS is very supportive in general of ES proposals. So for every proposal that got at least 20% support, ISS has recommended to vote for. So it's a very ES investor, if we can say it is an investor. So, main findings. First of all, we can see that ES funds are more supportive than non-ES funds, and we can see that within family type, right? So we can see that for funds from ES families and also from funds from non-ES families. But the more interesting result to us is the fact that ES funds in non-ES families vote strategically. Why strategically? Because they provide more support when the votes are not very important, but when it matters, they align their vote with their family. So we conclude that family prevails over the stated goals of the funds, because in votes that matter, they will support the family and vote consistent with their ideology. So overall, we will say that they are greenwashing votes, right? Because this allows them to provide a high average support for ES proposal, which is consistent with voting accountability and the fiduciary duty. But yet, when it matters, they will stick with the family, right? Now, you can say, why do they bother in voting strategically in the first place, right? Well, the idea of strategic voting means that someone is actually looking at the votes, but they are not sophisticated enough to identify this strategic voting behavior, right? Actually, what we find is that this strategic behavior is driven by mutual funds that are offered to institutional investors in a way that can monitor votes. What happens for retail funds? Actually, for retail funds, there is no differential support for ES proposals, for ES funds. So they don't bother in voting strategically because they know that the retail investors are not able to monitor votes. Part of the reason why is because of how the votes are disclosed, and I will go into the detail later on. So the data that we are going to use is from ISS from 2011 to 2021. The version that you had in the conference was until 2018, but given the increase in the importance and number of offerings lately, we have updated our data set. And we have about 2,000 ES proposals. Luckily, in the last version of ISS, they are classifying all the proposals, so we don't have to manually classify some of them. And we rely specifically in their classification of socially and responsible investment, which we call ES proposals. So this is just an idea over time of how many ES proposals we have, which are the green bars, and then the gray bars are governance proposals. So in general, there are more governance than ES proposals in public companies. Now, how do we classify an ES fund versus a non-ES fund? Because I said before, the name matters, and it's even the regulation talks about the fund name. We will rely on the fund name in particular to say whether a fund is ES or not. There is evidence in the finance literature that investors rely on the name in order to make the investment decision, and that sometimes funds change their name in order to reflect hot styles and capture flows. And also because of the names rule that prohibit the use of misleading names. So what is an ES fund? Basically a fund that says or contains the words sustainable, social, responsible, impact, and so on. Altogether, we have 343 ES funds in the sample. And we check the prospectuses and we find that we don't have type 1 error. So to be fair, we checked 100% of the funds until 2018, and now we need to check the last part of the sample. So overall, we have checked 50% of the funds and found no type 1 error. So for instance, we have BlackRock Impact US Equity Fund, state that the funds provides total return by investing in a portfolio of equity securities of companies with positive aggregate societal impact outcomes, right? So this part is in the prospectus, which is consistent with the name that they provide. We also check non-ES funds. We do find some type 2 error, and it's mostly driven by ES families. So for instance, Calvert may offer a fund that doesn't contain any of the keywords in the name, but we know that they are still ES, so we address that in robustness test. We also have some tests related to the Morningstar classification, and in the next version of the paper, we use the Morningstar classification also as an alternative. How do we classify families? Of course, course, it is not easy to classify ex ante, so we discussed before the issue with stating whether you are one type or the other, because there may be some cheap talk. And in particular, there is evidence that US investors that signed the United Nations Principle for Responsible Investment are not greener than investors that do not. So how do we do it? We will rely on what they did in the previous year regarding their votes in order to classify families. Why do we look at the prior year? To avoid any potential issue with a mechanical relationship, right? And we will have two proxies. The first one is based on family ideology that I will explain in a bit. And the second one is simply took all the funds of the family over the year and take the average number of votes for relative to the total number of votes. And that's it. Now, the second classification is super simple. There is no mystery behind it. And the two classifications are very correlated. So if you need to classify an investor based on ES only, you can simply rely on the simple measure. For the other measure, it's a measure based on the political science literature, and it's based on the idea that two voters will share the same ideology if they vote in the same way, right? And if they vote differently, then they will be on the opposite extremes. This methodology has been applied already in finance, so by Bolton et al. In 2020, and we follow basically the same methodology. In order to apply this methodology, we need to aggregate all the votes of the family. So following them, we will use the majority vote. So if we have 10 mutual funds voting in one way and one on the other, we will consider the vote of these 9 votes. Now, different from their paper, we are only going to consider ES proposals because in our case, we are trying to define the ideology in terms of ES and not on governance in general. So this is the distribution of ideologies using our two measures. So we will have a cutoff on the 30% of families on one side or the other. So families in orange are non-ES and families in gray are ES. Now the 30% is because the largest families are actually non-ES. So in terms of vote, we broadly have 50% of the votes on each side. So this is the classification for 2020. I thought it was more timely to show this now. In the paper, we also have the 2012 for comparison with Bolton, but they look pretty much the same. So BlackRock was non-ES in 2012, it is non-ES in 2020. So because this one is easier to understand, basically in 2020, BlackRock supported less than 5% of ES proposals, even though they are making huge claims about all the sustainability and so on. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have Calvert or Paxworth, which are traditionally ES families. Now, ISS is more or less in the middle, so it is not random that we have the largest bar in here. It's because many families just vote consistent with ISS. And in terms of the average support, they support about 65% of ES proposals. Now, ideology is expected to be persistent, right? You don't change your mind from one period to the other. Because we have several years in our sample, we can actually test that, which is different from Bolton. They only have 1 year. And what we find is that using either of our proxies, ideology is highly persistent. So if you are classified as ES in year T, you have a 90% chances of being classified as ES in T+1 and similar in T+2, which is good because it gives some reliability to our proxy. Okay, now I think the empirical evidence, the plot that I showed you before, for me it is the more convincing part of the story, but we all want to see some regressions, right, to test the significant differences between the coefficients. So what we are going to do in this case is we will have regressions at the vote level for each mutual fund, And the dependent variable is the probability of vote for. And our main coefficient of interest will be the interaction between whether the vote is contested, meaning close to the 50% threshold, and the ES fund in non-ES family, which is our group of interest. Now, what do we mean by contested? In this version of the paper, we are using a small interval around the 50%, so from 44 to 55%, and non-contested all the votes between 20 and 80. Now, why do we focus only on this interval? Because, as I showed you before, in this interval, ISS is supporting all of the ES proposals. In addition, none of these proposals receive management support, so we believe that this is a much homogeneous sample than if we also aggregate the very low support proposals. In any case, we have robustness tests for that, and the results hold. Now, ES non-ES is equal to 1 if it is a ES fund from a non-ES family, and 0 if it is a non-ES fund from a non-ES family. Why do we choose this control group, given that we have 3 other categories? First of all, because we think it is the more natural control group. For instance, using non-ES fund from non-ES family, we can control for family-specific factors and the fact that in some cases the decision may be driven by the family. We mitigate concerns about the mechanical relationship, so if we compare ES families and non-ES family, the result may be driven by the family affiliation rather than the fund. And because we don't find misclassified funds in non-ES families. But in any case, I will show you that the result hold if we use any of the other 2 control groups. Now, we have time varying controls both at the family and the fund level, and we have fixed effect. I will go into the details of the fixed effect with the results. Now, maybe you're wondering, can mutual funds really anticipate the result? So this is work in progress because we are interviewing mutual fund managers and also some proxy contest companies. So let me show you more or less a preview of what we find. So mutual funds have signals about what is going to be the outcome of the proposal. I'm sure that these signals are very familiar to you because this is what the literature finds as well, right? So we can, at least in some cases, we know that, for instance, the identity of the sponsor matters. We know that ISS recommendation matters, that the management recommendation matters, right? And so, of course, mutual funds have this information before casting their vote, and then they can have an informed decision of what's going to happen in the meeting. They also have the description of the proposal in the text. So an example that 66% of the people that we interview gave us is the fact that this year many proposals include scope 3 emissions, and they know that this proposal will get very low support, but proposals that involve scope 1 or 2 emissions receive higher support. So they have a very good idea of what's going to happen, even though, of course, no one can predict exactly what's going to happen. Now, we talk also to proxy solicitors, which was very interesting. So, of course, they also have the same information used by mutual funds. Now, what we find interesting is that at the beginning of the season, they made predictions already based on previous information that they have on the proposal to see which proposal is more likely to be contested or not. Why do they do that? Because then they sell their services to their companies, and if they identify that the proposal is likely to be contested, they engage in some kind of dialogue with the companies and they prepare them for the conversations. So they don't contact the investor directly, but they prepare companies to talk to investors close to the meeting to win their support. And they get very timely information because they have the information from custodians. And apparently they can even have like daily updates on how many investors have voted. And even though they cannot perfectly identify the investor, they have a good idea of who is the one voting. Okay, so let's go to the regressions. The first result that I'm going to show you is that ES funds are actually more supportive of uncontested proposals. So if we set contested equal to 0, we end up with this coefficient, and this coefficient means that when the proposal is uncontested, the support for by ES funds is about 20% higher than the support of non-ES funds. Regarding fixed effects, so in this specification we include meeting fixed effect, proposal type fixed effect, family fixed effect, and the same holds, I will not tell you this one because we cannot estimate the coefficient. Now, interestingly, maybe some of you have the idea that family will define the vote. Actually, when we look exactly at the same proposal, using family time proposal fixed effect results, so column 3 and 6, we still find the differential support of 20%. So not all the votes are defined at the family level. Mutual funds have discretion over how to vote, and the results are there. Now, what happens when the proposal is contested? Well, this differential support drops by a very large amount, actually, right? So this 20% minus the 13% means that about 50% of this higher support provided by ES funds is not actually there when the proposal is contested. Okay, I need to run a bit because I think I'm running out of time. Well, it doesn't matter the fixed effect that we use. For instance, we can look at funds voting on two proposals in the same meeting. One proposal that ends up close to the majority threshold, another one that ends up further away. The results are shown in this table. Now we can also look at, for instance, a proposal of political contribution in one company that ended up far away, and a proposal on political contribution that ended up close to the majority threshold, and the results are presented here. So it is not like they follow very strict voting policies and vote for the same type of proposal. Depending on the outcome that they expect that will happen, they will switch the vote according to the family preferences as well. Okay, now the most important part and the new addition of the paper is the fact that strategic voting makes sense only when you can fool investors by doing so. Now, for retail funds, we know that they rely on very simple signals such as ratings, but institutional investors are more sophisticated. Now, another interesting quote is from the same speech that I mentioned before, says that it's hard to see how retail investors can formulate an accurate and reliable picture of how fund votes on ESG issues when they are forced to parse voluminous forms that are often bespoke shorthand for shareholder proposal. So this is the view of the SEC acting chair at the time. Retail investors cannot have an idea of what's going on, right? So the way in which we define institutional and retail funds is just by looking at whether all the shares are offered to institutional investors or only some of them, following Evans and Fallenbrandt. And the results here show, again, that what we documented as a strategic behavior is driven by institutional funds. Okay. So the first three columns, when we look at retail investors, the results are not there. But more importantly, not even in uncontested proposal we find the result. So they vote exactly in the same way because probably retail investors cannot tell whether they are supporting proposal or not in the first place. However, for the institutional funds, we do find that the support is higher in uncontested, but lower when the proposal is contested. Now, the next question is, do really institutional funds monitor vote? So in order to test that, what we are going to do here is we are going to look at the flows following the disclosure of the votes. So the votes are disclosed at the end of August. So we will look at what happens 3 months after, 6 months after, 9 months after, and see whether institutional investors really care about the support provided by the funds. So these are the results. First of all, we have the first four columns are institutional investors, and we can observe here that when the support is low, the flows are also lower. But for retail funds, there is no reaction to low support, right? So here the result is not significant immediately after, but we cannot tell really how long does it take for them to monitor the vote. So it could be that it takes some time, but it is there for broader windows such as 0 to 6 months or 0 to 9 months. And again, nothing there for retail funds. So this supports the view that families are doing that in order to hide the low support or the ideology for investors that have the ability to monitor. If you cannot monitor, you don't even bother to engage in strategic voting in the first place. Now we use governance proposal as a placebo. We don't find the result, even we find the opposite coefficient, if any. We also find that the result is not something that all ES funds regarding the family will do. Actually, when we use ES funds from non-ES family, we find the same strategic behavior. And we have a bunch of robustness tests that are very boring, so I won't bother. So just to conclude, ES funds are more supportive of ES proposal than non-ES funds. And probably because many of you are from the legal part, you know that there is another paper showing that, right? But here what we are adding is that actually it is not the same, for instance, for retail funds. So this differential support is not there for investors that cannot monitor the vote. Now, ES funds in non-ES family will vote strategically. Why? Because they want to show a high support consistent with the fiduciary duty, but they also want to align with the family when it matters the most. So I think that's it. I will stop here, and if there are any questions, I can come back to the other result.